This conversation is part of the James J. Blanchard Living Library of Michigan Political History, a project of the Michigan Political History Society. Hello, I'm Kyle Malin, editor of the MERS newsletter, joined by Susan Steiner-Bullhouse. Today we're going to have a conversation with Bill Ballenger, former state legislator, state department director, racing commissioner, editor of two publications, including the Ballenger Report, a well-read political newsletter online. Bill, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, Kyle and Susan.
So I went through a lot of things that people may recognize your name and attach you to, but what do you attach yourself to? When you think of, if you were to put your name on the tombstone, what would you want it to say?
Terminal political junkie?
Terminal political junkie, explain that.
Well, I started out in politics, if you want to call it that, back in the 1960s. Working for the Republican State Central Committee in the fall of 1965 when Ellie Peterson was the first female state party chairman for either major political party in the entire country. And 2 years later, I found myself in the Michigan legislature, in the state house at the age of 27 in 1968, served one 2-year term, and then one 4-year term in the Senate, and we were off to the races. There's a lot more I can tell you about what I did and how that happened in the 1960s. And I never would have thought, growing up in Flint, Michigan, that I would have ended up in that place. I wanted to write. I wanted to be either an author or a novelist or short story writer or maybe a journalist. And strangely enough, I started out writing when I got out of college, and then I got into politics, and then, some 20 years later, I end up where I really wanted to begin, journalism. But it was about politics again, Michigan politics. So, terminal political junkie, it covers the waterfront. A lot of different avenues to arrive at that particular destination.
What was the one particular item that made you switch from wanting to be a writer to go into politics? I know that you were overseas in Ireland for a while where you did do writing, then you came back here. So what made you decide to go from journalism into politics?
It was really odd. I had a strange choice in the fall of 1965. I had an interview set up with Time magazine coming back from Ireland. I could have had that. I might have been hired, would have gone into journalism, would not have been in politics in any way, shape, or form. But also, there were connections I had back in Michigan through my wife at the time, the former Virginia Lee Woodard, nicknamed Bunny, in Owasso. She had a very good friend who was on the Republican State Central Committee, who was very close to Ellie Peterson, and she said, I've got this guy with a somewhat sketchy journalistic writing background coming over from Ireland. He might want to remain in Michigan rather than take some exotic job with a national magazine in New York. Do you have anything for him down in Lansing? Well, she was looking for somebody in public relations, if you can believe it, and I had never been involved in the Republican Party in any way, shape, or form. And Ellie Peterson hired me on the spot as an assistant director of public relations. And after a year, she made me director of research at the Republican State Central Committee headquarters.
In Lansing?
In Lansing. And we were living on a farm, Bunny and I, between Ovid and Langsburg, and I would commute down for 7 straight years. I commuted from the farm down to Lansing. The first 3 years to the Republican State Party headquarters where Ellie Peterson presided. And then the next 4 years as a member of the legislature. That's another story. But in any event, that's how I got into politics. It could have happened very easily. I never got into it. I only took one political science course in my entire college career, ever. I was an English major. I never thought about, going into politics. I'd always had an interest in politics. I kind of followed it in the newspapers, but really in a very casual way, I thought. And so it's amazing that literally 5 years, 6 years after I graduated from college, never having really done anything. I was not a political activist. I was not a member of any political organizations until I took a job with Ellie Peterson. I found myself the youngest Republican legislator in 1968.
Did she ask you to run? Did somebody ask you to run? Did it come from yourself?
No, that is another thing. There was a very colorful character that many people in Michigan politics will remember, and he just died recently, Jerry Rowe, who was the executive director, became the executive director for the Republican Party. He had been brought up by Ellie Peterson from Washington when she was a national vice chairman for the Republican Party. She discovered him down there. He said to me, when I started working at the Republican headquarters, he said, "Ballenger, what are you doing at night when you go home?"
That's a loaded question.
Up in Shiawassee County. And he said, "You ought to get started, form a young Republican club up there." And so I did. And in the space of like 4 months, it was the third biggest young Republican club in the entire state. Next thing I knew, the county Republican Party, which had been through a bloodbath in 1964 with Barry Goldwater as the party's nominee getting shellacked by Lyndon Johnson. Now remember, we're talking about early 1966 at this point. They were looking for a party chairman, They said, "Ballenger, you did such a good job with young Republicans, we'll make you party chairman." So I became the youngest party chairman in the state. I was only 25 years old, and I'd just come back after a year in Ireland to begin working for the Republican Party, and I found myself as a Republican chairman.
That's really interesting. Now, in your background, your family background,
Yeah.
Was there anybody involved in politics there?
There actually was way back in the 19th century. If you dig into any family tree of anybody who's lived in this country very long, and you're going to find politicians somewhere. My family on both sides came to this country in the 18th century. I have antecedents who fought in the American Revolution, in Virginia and in Connecticut regiments. So I go back a long way. So I had a great-grandfather. He was the first William Sylvester Ballenger, born in 1833, and he was an elected state representative in Indiana. And he was a small-town lawyer, and he died at the age of only 39. And then his son, my grandfather, came to Flint in 1888 at the age of 22 as a bookkeeper for the Flint Wagon Works, which was a horse and buggy manufacturer before the so-called horseless carriage had really taken root. And he became the first treasurer of Buick and Chevrolet, and he became one of the original investors in General Motors with Billy Durant in 1906, 1908. He was not a politician, although he once was elected, I think, to the Flint School Board. He served on that for 6 years, but he wasn't a politician. So in recent vintage, there was nobody in my family. My father, again, served on the Flint School Board. He was elected to the Flint School Board, but my father is a politician? I don't think so. He was a banker. He was a trust officer, the farthest thing from a politician. So I don't know where my interest came other than just being an avid reader of newspapers and magazines when I was growing up, when I was in my 40s and in the 1940s and 1950s. But all of a sudden I decided, this looks like fun. And I think I can actually use my writing ability to my advantage in politics. And, I wrote a weekly newspaper column every year, every week. I was in the legislature for 6 years. So I drew on my journalism there.
You mentioned Flint, that your grandfather, I believe, was the first Ballenger to come to
Right.
Flint. Ballenger is a very prominent name in Flint. You were born in Flint. And take us from your birth, your schooling in Flint, through college, what it is you learned, what it is that you aspired to going through school.
Well, it was very interesting. I grew up in a well-to-do neighborhood in the southwest Flint. I was born before Pearl Harbor, March 28th, 1941. My next door neighbors were the son and grandchildren of C.S. Mott of the Mott Foundation, very prominent Flint family, well known nationally. There were, wealthy people living all around me. The president of General Motors, Harlow Curtis, who was Time Magazine's Man of the Year in 1954, lived just 2 blocks away.
And didn't Summerfield?
Arthur Summerfield was the
postmaster?
Postmaster General for Dwight Eisenhower, lived just a couple of streets away. And you know what? Everybody went to public school. Everybody. We walked up to a public school on Corunna Road, half a mile away, every single day, in the same building for 10 straight years, kindergarten through 9th grade. Totally different today in Flint. We won't go into that. But
No buses that will take you for half a mile.
What's gone on in the Flint public school system is not a pretty picture, so let's not go there. But back in the day, we were all egalitarians. We all went to public school. And, then I went away to secondary school, a boarding school in New Jersey, Lawrenceville, 7 miles away from Princeton. My father was a Princeton graduate, class of 1929. So I always aspired to go to Princeton. I got in Princeton. I went to Princeton 4 years, graduated in 1962. So that was my life growing up in Flint. But I still have strong connections with people I went to school with. There are even high school reunions for Flint Central High School, now closed, and Flint Tech, closed since 1959. And I go to those reunions, and they all look at each other and say, "Was Ballenger in our class?" And I wasn't. But the reason I go there is because my classmates at Zimmerman Junior High School went on to Flint Tech and Flint Central. So I go to their reunions. So I still have a strong connection with Flint today, and I live there most of the time.
So as far as your time in Princeton, do you still keep in touch with the folks that you went to Princeton with, and how influential was that in your life?
I think it was very influential, yes. I mean, my closest friends at Princeton, I'm still in close touch with. None of them are in Michigan. There were very few people who went to Princeton or to the Ivy League from Michigan at that time. There's still not that many proportionately, but in those days it was really a sparse group. My best friends at Princeton were from Tennessee, Baltimore, New Orleans, a lot of Southerners at Princeton, more than any other Ivy League school. I was in a club that had a lot of Southerners in it. So I'm very close friends with all those people, keep in touch with them over time. The English department at Princeton was staggeringly brilliant. We had Carlos Baker, who was the biographer of Ernest Hemingway. We had Lawrence Thompson, who was a biographer of Melville and Robert Frost. These were people who not only lectured us, but Princeton always had and still has a system called the precept system, preceptorial, founded by Woodrow Wilson when he was president of Princeton in the early 20th century, in which once a week, small groups, literally 6, 8, 10 students, have an hour seminar with the greatest minds in English literature. In the academic world at that time. People like Baker and Lawrence Thompson and Dudley Johnson and Willard Thorpe. These people were giants. So, I mean, I had a huge positive experience as an English major. And you write a senior thesis at Princeton. I wrote it on H.L. Mencken, the legendary journalist from the early 20th century. And so this was part of my reasoning about wanting to become a writer. And that led to where I talked about in the beginning.